In November of 2019, while Toyota's top executives stood in front of cameras and told the world that fully electric cars were not ready yet, a very different meeting was happening behind closed doors. Toyota was quietly signing a deal with BYD, the Chinese company most of the industry still saw as a cheap battery maker punching above its weight. Nobody outside a small circle of engineers knew the deal existed for years. Toyota's own dealers did not know. Its American executives barely mentioned it in public. But that quiet handshake between two supposed enemies rescued Toyota's stumbling electric car program, changed how every major automaker on Earth thinks about building an EV, and may have handed Toyota's most dangerous rival the exact tools it needs to end Toyota's reign as the biggest car company on the planet. This is the story of the deal Toyota never wanted anyone to notice, why it worked far better than anyone at Toyota expected, and why the same partnership that quietly rescued the world's biggest automaker might now be arming the one company capable of taking that title away from it for good. To understand why this deal mattered, you have to understand how much Toyota had riding on being right about electric cars, and how wrong the rest of the industry thought it was. Toyota built its modern identity on a single bet made in 1997, when it launched the Prius, the first mass-produced hybrid car in the world. For 2 decades that bet looked eccentric. Analysts mocked hybrids as a stopgap technology, a training wheel powertrain for drivers not brave enough for a real electric car. Then Tesla arrived, then the Chinese EV wave arrived, and the pressure on every legacy automaker to go all electric all at once became almost impossible to resist publicly. Toyota resisted anyway. Executives kept insisting that pure electric vehicles, hampered by range limits, thin charging networks, and steep prices, were not yet ready to replace the internal combustion engine for most drivers on Earth. The press called Toyota slow. Some called it in denial. Its first real global EV, the BZ4X, launched to a disappointing reception, and when Koji Sato took over as chief executive in 2023, he inherited a company widely seen as years behind Tesla, behind Volkswagen, and badly behind China. Toyota's own leadership never fully abandoned the hybrid-first defense either. For years, the company argued publicly that no single powertrain, not hybrid, not hydrogen, not battery electric, should win by government mandate before the market itself decided, a stance that made Toyota an easy target for critics who accused it of dragging its feet on purpose. Rivals like Volkswagen and General Motors poured tens of billions into all-electric platforms and loudly announced dates by which they would stop selling combustion engines entirely. Toyota announced no such date. It kept building hybrids, kept building trucks, and kept insisting quietly that it already had a plan for electric cars that it simply was not ready to explain. Inside the company, that confidence was not blind faith either. Toyota had spent decades treating its supply chain as sacred, sourcing engines, transmissions, and electronics almost entirely through its own network of suppliers, a system credited with making Toyota the most reliable and most profitable mass-market automaker in the world. Breaking from that system, even quietly, was not a decision Toyota's leadership would have made lightly. It was a decision made because the alternative, building a competitive battery from scratch on Toyota's own timeline, was going to take too long, and the Chinese EV market was not going to wait. Then the results started coming in, and the story flipped. By 2025, Toyota, Lexus, Daihatsu, and Hino together delivered a record 11.3 million vehicles, more than Volkswagen, more than Hyundai Kia, more than General Motors, more than anyone on Earth. In the first half of its 2026 fiscal year, Toyota and Lexus alone shipped 5.2 million vehicles, up from 5.02 million a year earlier. Electrified models made up 46.9% of that total. But look closer at what electrified actually meant. Of those 2.47 million electrified vehicles, 2.27 million were hybrids. Fully electric cars accounted for barely 101,000 units. Toyota was winning the electrification race almost entirely on hybrids, the very technology the rest of the industry had spent a decade calling outdated. The company revised its annual profit forecast upward to 3.4 trillion yen, even as tariffs and Chinese competition squeezed nearly every other automaker on Earth. This is the part of the story most people already know. Toyota bet on hybrids, and hybrids won. What almost nobody outside the company understood was that Toyota's public patience with pure electric cars was never really patience at all, it was cover. Because while the public line was that EVs were not ready, Toyota had already found a shortcut into the EV race years earlier, through the one company built to make that shortcut necessary. Keep that in mind, because it is the reason everything that follows actually happened. If stories like this, the quiet decisions that end up reshaping entire industries, are the kind of thing you find interesting, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribing costs nothing, and it means you will not miss the next one. By the time BYD and Toyota's names appeared together on a joint venture registration in the spring of 2020, the real story was already months old. In July 2019, the two companies signed a first agreement to jointly develop sedans and low-floor electric SUVs for the Chinese market, along with the batteries that would power them. Then, on November 7, 2019, without a press conference and with almost no coverage outside trade publications, they signed a second agreement, this one to form an actual joint company. Whatever Toyota was about to admit to the world, it had already decided the answer months before anyone was allowed to ask the question. That second agreement was not a supply contract. It was something far stranger for a company built on doing everything itself. Toyota Motor Corporation, the automaker famous for the Toyota production system, for building its own engines, its own transmissions, its own supplier network down to the smallest bolt, agreed to form a 50-50 joint research company with BYD, called BYD Toyota EV Technology, or BTET. Operations began in May 2020. Hiroshi Sakishi took the chairman's seat for Toyota. Zhao Bingen became BTET's chief executive for BYD. Toyota's own executive vice president, Shigeki Terashi, described the arrangement as a way for the two companies to become what he called teammates, a word that would have sounded almost unthinkable a few years earlier, when Toyota executives privately viewed BYD as an unproven battery assembler, riding a wave of Chinese government subsidies. Both companies split the capital evenly. Both transferred engineers. Toyota was funding, staffing, and legitimizing the very company that would soon become its biggest global threat. It is worth remembering who BYD actually was at that point. Founded in 1995 as a battery manufacturer, the company's name stood for Build Your Dreams, and by 2008 it had become the first company in the world to mass-produce a plug-in hybrid. By 2015, BYD's combined electric and plug-in hybrid sales already ranked first in the world, 4 years running, largely unnoticed outside China. Toyota was not partnering with a startup. It was partnering with the one company on Earth that had spent longer perfecting battery chemistry than almost anyone, including Toyota itself. That imbalance of expertise is exactly what made the arrangement so uncomfortable for a company like Toyota to admit to. Toyota had spent decades building a reputation as the company other automakers copied. Now, quietly, it was the one doing the copying and paying for the privilege in shared engineering hours instead of cash alone. The first product of that partnership was the Toyota BZ3, a battery electric sedan built through FAW Toyota, a joint venture dating back to 2000, when Chinese regulations required foreign automakers to partner locally to sell cars at all. The BZ3 launched in April 2023. Under the floor sat a BYD Blade lithium iron phosphate battery, a BYD electric motor, and a BYD-built control system, all wrapped in a Toyota badge and Toyota's own ETNGA platform, the same architecture underneath the disappointing BZ4X. On its first day of sales, the BZ3 pulled in 5,000 orders with a claimed range beyond 600 kilometers. By 2026, aggressive price cuts had pushed the entry price down to roughly 93,800 yuan, about $13,500, making it the cheapest electric Toyota ever sold anywhere in the world. It worked so well that Toyota expanded the arrangement to a second sedan, the BZ7, launched in 2025 and sold in 2026 through its other Chinese joint venture, GAC Toyota. Meanwhile, Toyota's own long-promised answer to BYD's battery, a solid-state pack the company had talked about since the early 2020s, kept sliding. The current public target sits somewhere around 2027 to 2028, years after BYD's Blade battery was already selling inside Toyota's own showrooms. None of it would have mattered if the story had stayed contained to China. It did not. For years, Toyota kept this arrangement easy to wave away as a China-only workaround for a China-only regulatory environment. That containment ended as Toyota pushed into its next electrification phase. As part of a reported $912 million push toward its first US-built electric vehicle, targeted for the first half of 2026 and a wider goal of 1 million EVs a year, Toyota widened its battery sourcing well beyond Panasonic and beyond China's borders in name only. Reporting on the strategy described Toyota's approach bluntly, with hybrids funding the company's finances while battery sourcing from BYD, alongside a separate hydrogen joint venture, quietly filled the gaps Toyota's own technology could not yet cover on its own. This landed at an especially delicate moment. Washington had spent years tightening rules around Chinese content in electric vehicle batteries, restricting tax credits and market access for anything tied too closely to what US law calls a foreign entity of concern, a category built specifically to cover companies based in or controlled by China. Those rules were written with exactly this kind of arrangement in mind, a foreign automaker leaning on Chinese battery technology to hit an American production target. For a company whose entire reputation was built on controlling every link of its own supply chain, leaning harder on the same company, threatening to overtake it globally, right as US policy grew more suspicious of exactly that kind of arrangement, was not a small detail. It was an admission that Toyota could not out-engineer BYD on batteries alone, not yet, and possibly not for years. There was a reason Toyota chose BYD's chemistry specifically, and it was not sentiment. Lithium-ion phosphate batteries, the kind BYD had spent 2 decades refining inside its Blade design, are cheaper to produce than the nickel and cobalt heavy packs Toyota and most Western automakers had bet on earlier, and they carry far less exposure to the volatile mining markets tied to those metals. They are also safer, more resistant to overheating, and easier to manufacture at scale, which is exactly why a company obsessed with cost control and reliability, the 2 pillars of the entire Toyota production system, would quietly choose a rival's chemistry over building an inferior version of its own. Toyota was not just borrowing convenience, it was borrowing the answer to a problem its own engineers had not solved as cheaply or as fast. And this was only the first of the uncomfortable truths hiding inside Toyota's quiet EV strategy. Because the batteries were never the whole story. In March 2026, BYD chairman Wang Chuanfu unveiled the second generation of the company's Blade battery, capable of charging from 20% to 97% in under 12 minutes, even in temperatures as low as -20 degrees Celsius, with a driving range on some models topping 1,000 kilometers. BYD said it planned to expand its own fast-charging network to 20,000 stations by the end of 2026, up from roughly 4,000. Every improvement BYD made to that battery flowed straight into the batteries sitting inside Toyota's own BZ3 and BZ7, the same cars Toyota was counting on to hold the line in China until its solid-state technology finally arrived. Toyota had not simply borrowed a battery. It had tied its own electric vehicle roadmap to the pace of a rival's research and development schedule, a rival with every incentive to keep improving, keep scaling, and keep growing more powerful with each passing year. And that rival was no longer confined to China either. Even in Australia, a market Toyota had led for 29 straight years, BYD's arrival forced Toyota to rush an extra 10,000 vehicles into the country and raise its own annual sales forecast just to hold its ground. Timed to the very week BYD staged a media event to celebrate almost 5,000 new BYD and Denza vehicles, arriving on its own car carrier fleet. The company Toyota had helped legitimize inside its own showrooms in China was now competing for Toyota's home turf everywhere else too. Toyota did not just borrow BYD's battery. It had, without quite meaning to, helped fund and validate the exact machine now aimed at ending Toyota's reign. Here is the number that makes the irony impossible to ignore. In 2025, BYD delivered roughly 4.6 million vehicles worldwide, edging past Ford's roughly 4.4 million and making BYD, for the first time, one of the 6 largest automakers on Earth. That same year, by most estimates, BYD also passed Tesla to become the world's single largest seller of electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles combined, a title Tesla had held for years before China's battery specialist quietly took it away. In the first half of 2026 alone, BYD sold 1.8 million new energy vehicles globally. Nearly 800,000 of those went overseas, a record for the company. Speaking to shareholders in June 2026, Wang Chuanfu laid out an explicit target to become the #1 automaker globally in terms of scale within 5 years, by 2031. Stella Li, BYD's head of international operations, told the Financial Times the company believed it could get there through what she called our own organic growth, without selling a single passenger car in the United States. The gap is still enormous. Toyota sold 11.3 million vehicles in 2025 against BYD's 4.6 million. But 5 years ago, BYD barely registered in that conversation at all. Toyota built the bridge that let BYD's batteries prove themselves on a global stage, inside Toyota's own cars, wearing Toyota's own badge. BYD is now driving straight across that bridge, and the destination on the other side looks a lot like Toyota's own market share. So what actually changed the EV industry? It came down to 3 things. First, Toyota proved that a company does not need to build every part of an electric car itself to compete in the EV race. Borrowing a rival's best technology, even a geopolitical rival's, can beat building an inferior version alone, and it can be far cheaper too. Every legacy automaker watching Toyota's BZ3 succeed in China, at a price nobody building their own battery from scratch could match, learned that lesson whether they wanted to or not. Second, that borrowed technology did not simply save Toyota's electric car program. It helped fund, staff, and legitimize the exact company now positioned to challenge Toyota for the title of the world's largest automaker, a company that spent years struggling for global credibility until one of the most respected names in the industry agreed to build cars on top of its batteries. Third, and this is the part the rest of the industry is still catching up to, the real battle in electric vehicles was never really about horsepower, range, or design. It is about who controls the battery supply chain. For now, despite everything Toyota, Ford, Volkswagen, and every other legacy automaker have spent building their own factories, that answer is still mostly written in China. Toyota just proved it out loud, and quietly, other automakers have already started following the same playbook, licensing Chinese battery chemistry and manufacturing know-how, instead of racing to reinvent it from scratch. Because in the end, the fastest way to compete with China's EV industry turned out to be partnering with it. Toyota's secret deal with BYD did not just fix a hole in its electric vehicle lineup. It quietly rewrote the rulebook every automaker on Earth is now copying, whether they admit it publicly or not. Next time, we are looking at the automaker that made the opposite bet, walking away from Chinese battery partnerships entirely and paying a price that makes Toyota's gamble look almost conservative by comparison. The company that spent 30 years telling the world it did not need anyone else's help just proved, quietly and reluctantly, that it did. The only question left is whether the rival it borrowed from will remember the favour, or simply use everything it learned building Toyota's cheapest EV to come take the rest of Toyota's empire too. If you want to understand where the rest of this industry is headed, subscribe, because that story is coming next.